here. Um, so welcome everybody who is joining us for our Portland Reasons to Believe chapter here on Zoom. This is the first time we're doing this, so bear with us as we work through the technology. We are actually streaming this on YouTube live as well. So those people who are on Zoom can join in and follow along the conversation. There'll be time for interaction. If you're on YouTube, you'll just be looking into our meeting. We are super privileged and excited to have Dr. AJ Roberts joining us here live with us. I want to just share a little bit about Dr. Roberts here before we get started. So it's great to have her here. I'm sharing her bio straight from the RTB website. But Dr. Roberts is a PhD scholar in molecular and cellular biology from the University of Pennsylvania. And she has an MA in Christian apologetics from Biola University. And I'm wearing my Biola shirt as well. So cheers to Biola, that's great. We've asked AJ to join in this unique format to talk with us about, in general, this subject of how these difficult, challenging situations with the virus that we're currently experiencing, and how that plays into God's overall plan, and how we can, the challenges that these face can drive us to discovery. And those discoveries can just broaden our view of God. So the way this is going to work is we're just going to turn it over to AJ, and she's going to share her screen and walk us through a presentation. And we'll let her kind of navigate the course of the presentation and pick up interactive dialogue where it makes sense. When you when it's appropriate to jump in and say something, just make sure that you unmute your mic so that you're not talking out into space. So with that, AJ, thank you so much for joining us, taking the time out of your busy schedule. I know you've been, with your expertise in virology, you've been called on a lot during this time. So we're really honored and privileged to have you join us.
Well, it's definitely true that I've been pretty busy, but I actually find that I'm in my element, and I actually really believe a lot in connecting with the Reasons to Believe chapters that we have throughout the country, and connecting with our partnership with Ratio Christi. And I find both of those great local, regional outlets for really diving in and asking questions and seeking a better way forward together, and one that really respects curiosity and differences and seeking truth and the activity of God in the world and in our lives. And so I always jump at the opportunity to connect with any of our chapters, like the Portland chapter, and to partner with Ratio Christi. So thanks for having me here today, Ben. So I'm approaching the presentation with sort of some thoughts that I've had for the last several years. And as I go through the presentation, I'll actually point you to other resources where different aspects of this talk are brought out in more depth or with a different emphasis. And I think those resources that I point you to are actually probably pretty helpful if you have questions about anything that I'm saying. If I seem to be glossing over something, maybe we can address that on the Q&A at the end. But and I'm also really sort of thinking out loud about a couple of other observations. One of them is bringing the whole sort of COVID pandemic, SARS coronavirus 2 situation that's surrounding us into these thoughts that I've been wrestling with for years. And also just trying to, maybe for those of us that are followers of Christ who are tuned in today, to really sort of put it in a context that is seasonally relevant. We're in Holy Saturday. We're in that in-between time between remembering Christ's crucifixion on Good Friday and the resurrection that we all look forward to at the end time, but the resurrection that drastically transforms the way that we understand reality and the way that we live our lives, that we'll celebrate tomorrow on Easter. And so I've got all of those elements that I'm trying to bring together and just to really facilitate some conversation and to challenge you maybe to think about the way you think about things, and to maybe grow in curiosity and grow in a compassionate response, especially to people who might see things differently than you do. And I think that type of activity right now, those types of actions can really benefit us at this time when we're kind of fearful and uncertain about the situations around us, and we're all feeling kind of vulnerable. So maybe we can take advantage of a situation that has us all feeling a little off balance to be a little bit more compassionate with everyone. So that's my hope for the talk today.
Hey, can I just jump in here and echo what you just said about finding the good that can come out of this bad situation?
Yeah.
And I have to say that that one of the great goods that I'm seeing coming out of it is that we're all motivated to be able to use this technology and to be able to connect. So we're socially distanced, but I can't tell you how many people say that they feel actually more socially connected because this window and this technology is giving us the ability to really transcend the physical barriers. So our ability to do this, what we're doing right now, is just awesome. And so it's one of the goods that is coming out of this.
So Ben, thanks for the introduction too. A little earlier, I always get a little uneasy when people are highlighting my bio points, but I think one important distinction to make is that although my degrees in molecular and cellular biology, that my experience is actually in studying viruses specifically and viral pathogenesis, the disease that viruses cause. And I actually spent 3 years at the National Institutes of Health from 2003 to 2006 working on the first SARS coronavirus. And I say first because this one is so similar to that one that it's officially been named SARS coronavirus 2. But we're referring to it, I think, in the mass media as COVID. And so I'll refer to it both ways on the few occasions where I mention it in the presentation. And although I'm only going to mention it probably half a dozen times, certainly when we get to the Q&A, I'm happy to cycle around and answer questions specifically on that topic. So let me get to my screen sharing and we'll start that presentation. So this was the topic that I was presented with, and so it's the one that I really like to engage. Too little knowledge or infinite potential for discovery, and I see those two things as two different ways to describe the same situation, and so that's what we'll be talking about today. Again, I blog at reasons.org, which is the Reasons to Believe web address. And my blog is called Theorems in Theology. And I actually have a blog out there titled the same title as this talk. So if you want to check that out, you can. So my first question, and yes, for interaction, is who's frustrated with not knowing what to believe about COVID? Mm-hmm. Can I hear some verbal responses?
Yes,
or?
That's true.
Yes, amen.
That's true.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, it really is challenging. And when you get frustrated, I want you to sort of ask yourself this question right now. What's your primary response when you get frustrated? Do you become dismissive? Like, this person is just saying something that is not what I heard other people say, and I just don't think I can believe it, or, so do you dismiss it, or do you become judgmental? Like, that person's saying that because they're driven by a political agenda, and I know I can't trust that. And how does it make you feel when you are uncertain what to believe? Does it stir up you in sort of a sense of a curiosity?
Yes.
And what can you do about your uncertainty? What's the best way out of your uncertainty? So I just want to caution or just remind everybody that, most of us who are going through this, maybe not so much the scientists and the medical doctors, although I am in contact with a lot of medical doctors, and I would probably just put them in a more educated but but equally uncertain position as most of us are experiencing. Public health officials, virologists like I am, people who sort of track viral diseases and viral epidemiology, maybe we have a few more tools we can rely on, but the uncertainties are real for all of us because this is a new and emerging situation. We haven't dealt with a coronavirus that has had this widespread impact. We haven't dealt with a major pandemic on a global level, at least since the 1950s, but really probably this big back to the 1918 influenza epidemic. And so it's really important for all of us to realize that many people who are desperately wanting to help us understand what's going on around us are on a constant learning curve themselves about what's the best advice we can give based on the data that we have today. And so I think that's really helpful to try and remind yourself that, yeah, I want answers so I can gain certainty, so I can be less fearful. But the answers I get today may sound slightly different than the answers that I get next week, because next week we're going to have more information, and next week's information is going to require that we revise what we believe about the situation if it's different than the information we have today. So I think that's really helpful in sort of moving forward, is to embrace the idea that there's going to be some uncertainty even as we're doing our best to make sense of what's going on around us. And this is primarily because of a problem that I think is universal and historically inescapable. We are finite creatures with finite understanding, something I call human finitude. Even Einstein and Hawking or Hugh Ross, or your go-to guru for knowledge, I mean, what they know about what can be known of reality is probably an immeasurable fraction. It's so small. There's so much to know. And so it's really that we suffer from too little knowledge. But if we try to put too much emphasis on that, then I think we lose the invitation to find out as much as we can. And that's where I would tie it into infinite potential for discovery. So this is captured by a cognitive scientist who's well known for his work in artificial intelligence. He's sometimes called the father of defeasible reasoning. And John Pollock puts it this way. He says, what you know is orders of magnitude less than what is true. And that's true for all of us. It's not just true for you, it's true for me. And like I said, it's true even for your go-to gurus of history or current times. And Shakespeare really kind of said the same thing centuries earlier when he says, in the words of Hamlet, that there are more things in heaven and earth, Horatio, than are dreamt of in your philosophy, right? So it's really important that we recognize that we have limited access to knowledge. We have limited understanding, even when we're seeking to understand as much as we can. And in our limited knowledge, I think one of the things that we need to constantly keep in mind is that sometimes we rush to judgment. We have superficial knowledge, and that superficial knowledge leads us to make conclusions. And when we get more knowledge, when we get better data or a different perspective, then we are called to defeasible reasoning, to belief revision, to take those things into consideration and maybe change our perspective slightly, or maybe change our perspective drastically. So I'm going to give you a very simple example in the next slide. And because my notes are going to pop up, maybe you want to cover the side of the screen where you see my notes so that you don't see where I'm going, because this will be better if you're sort of free thinking and not reading what's to come. So this is an example of human finitude and how it can impact the way that we see a problem and reach a solution. And so here's this string of numbers, 2, 4, 8. You can turn your mics on if you want. What's the next number in the series? Some of you may have seen me use this example before if you've heard me give a similar talk.
10.
10. 16. Yeah. These are some great possibilities. 16, 10. Anybody come up with anything slightly different? Maybe 32? Yeah. So if you think it's just a doubling of the number before, you might come up with the number 16. If you think it's a series of numbers that are even, but not divisible by 6, the next number in the string would be 10. If you think that you get the next number in the series by multiplying the two previous numbers together, you get the number 34. If you think that you get the next number in the series by multiplying the three numbers before or all the numbers before, in this example, the next number would be 64. And so this is a very simple numerical example to emphasize that we collect data and we bring different assumptions into our observations of the data. And those assumptions and the way that we view the simplest or most direct or the most imaginative or most clever conclusion is the one that we'll find probably the most satisfying to us. But then we have to sometimes become persuasive if somebody sees the problem or the answer differently. So maybe I could convince you all that the best answer is 7004 because I actually had an equation like this in mind. It took quite some time for someone to come up with this equation, but it's a pretty simple series of plugging a number in and then let the equation run and out pops another number. And so if you do that with the number 1, the answer you get is 2. If you do that with the next number in a simple series of 2, you get 4, 3, 8, 4, 7004. And so there are ways to view the data that are what is known as empirical equivalence. So from the data at hand, we don't have any way to distinguish which of these answers on the right are the best answer because we don't know what the underlying system is. And that points to another way that our human finitude leaves us with places that are oblique, they're inaccessible as to which of these answers is the best. Well, we may not have enough data to be able to answer that question. And so I think that's a helpful thing to remember as we move on. So what do you do when something doesn't make sense? This is just repeating the earlier question before about the COVID confusion. Is your response to be dismissive or judgmental, or is it to spark curiosity? Something that might lead you into asking questions or trying to get more data or more perspectives in order to better understand what's going on. And here, because I know that some people who might be tuning in, especially with Ratio Christi or a guest of somebody from the Reasons to Believe chapter, you may not have the same theistic outlook or Christian outlook that I have in my worldview. And you might be tempted to say, this is great, curiosity in the natural world, absolutely. This is what science is all about. And science is our most reliable knowledge that we could possibly have. But I would suggest that maybe, just maybe, you want your curiosity to extend beyond those things that are just part of the scientific, exploratory, tangible elements of the natural world. Maybe you want to ask, maybe you want to be curious about how we actually experience life together in ways that can't be put in a test tube or measured or reproduced experimentally. And so one of the things, how many of you, mic's on again, please. How many of you have heard Anthony Fauci, the director of NIAID, that's the National Institutes of Allergy and Infectious Diseases. How many of you have heard Dr. Fauci say, our models are only as good as the assumptions that you put into them?
Yes.
Yep.
Yes.
Absolutely.
He's actually been repeating this quite a bit in the news. And I think he's trying to address all the people that are saying, hey, wait a minute, why does the model keep changing? It's because our behavior is changing, and it's because we're learning more about the virus and its ability to spread and be transmitted. How many of you are frustrated that, 2-3 weeks ago, people were telling you, no, don't wear masks, leave them for the healthcare professionals, you don't need them. And now, just this past few days, maybe a week ago by now, time kind of blurs when we're in this information overload, but maybe a week ago, the CDC, Center Disease for Control in the US, basically said, we want you to wear face coverings if you're going out into public in an environment where you're not going to be able to physically distance by 6 feet. How many are frustrated by that mixed message?
Me.
Yeah, right. And so were they lying to you because they didn't want you to have protection 3 weeks ago? Were they more concerned about the healthcare professionals and not concerned about you? No, I mean, neither one of those things are true. yes, we needed to possibly make some small level of self-sacrifice to make sure that the healthcare professionals had the medical masks, the N95s and the masks that they really need. So there wasn't a rush and we were hoarding those, because most of us 3 weeks ago, we all believed weren't at great risk. There was some risk, but not great risk. And we also thought the primary way that the virus was being spread was through respiratory droplets. And so if that's true, and you're trying to protect yourself from getting the virus, you probably aren't going to be wearing the N95 masks properly in a way to protect yourself from that type of virus. And so you're probably going to be wasting a precious resource. But one of the things that we've learned in the in-between times is that there seems to be a very significant level of spread from a person who feels completely well, but is actually shedding the virus to other people. And so now the mask is meant to be a barrier that you who may feel healthy when you breathe out, and just when you breathe, it doesn't have to be a cough. When you breathe or when you speak, you're releasing respiratory particles into the air, and the very small ones can actually stay airborne. And so this virus can be transmitted through airborne, through respiratory droplets, or through respiratory droplets that have fallen on surfaces and dried. You touch that, the virus is still viable on those hard surfaces, and then your hands become a mechanism of transfer of the virus from a surface to your eyes, nose, mouth. All can be portals of entry for the SARS coronavirus to set up an infection. So now the mask is to keep your breath next to your face and not out in front of, and not projected out into the atmosphere to land on surfaces or infect someone else. So, but this is a very important point that Dr. Fauci makes, not just in regard to the spread of coronavirus, but in regard to all of the ways that we sort of sort through the data and understand what's going on around us. And I would say even at the level of understanding what's true about the nature of reality and the role of God in the world around us. And so one of the questions we might constantly ask ourselves are we bringing wrong assumptions into our models? Or is the person I'm talking to bringing different assumptions into their models? And are there ways that we can explore what those assumptions are that will actually facilitate us coming to understand what the other person's thinking, how the other person's viewing this situation from their perspective? Or are there ways that we can explore together? Are we, each of us independently, and are we together bringing the best assumptions we can to our models? Or are there things that we're overlooking? And so I like to, when I can, point to other scientists in history and their thoughts along certain lines to sort of flesh out some of these things. And so Francis Crick was one of the co-discoverers of the structure of DNA. And he has written a few books, and one of them is called What Mad Pursuit. And in What Mad Pursuit, he's basically unpacking just the dedication that he had to have. He and Watson had to have, and their other colleagues like Rosalind Franklin, who actually contributed to coming to the working model of DNA as a double helix. And so in this book, he basically unpacks how dedicated and tenaciously he was seeking the answer, and how curiosity drove him on in determination to not give up until they came to an understanding that the DNA is a double helix model with complementary strands. And in the same book, early on in the book, he actually is reflecting on questions of faith, or questions of God and religion. And it struck me as I was reading this that he came across a couple of misconceived ideas about God and about faith. And when he realized that his ideas were incorrect, he basically dismissed the whole concept that faith, or that God, or a world where God was at work, was of any significance whatsoever. And it just struck me, those two things in drastic parallel to one another. He has questions about the natural world, and he confesses that it takes effort and dedication and curiosity to seek out the right answers. And yet he has some experience with a faith-based or spiritual or a God-formed world. And instead of taking that same tenacious curiosity to what have I misunderstood, what might there be true here that I just haven't discovered yet, he just really doesn't pursue it, even though he confesses again in the book that both of those paths take effort and dedication. He just makes a choice that he's willing to pursue one, but not the other. And so that always strikes me, especially because God actually, throughout Scripture, we can see that he really says that the kind of truth that he's talking about can be found, but it is found by those people who seek with a tenacious and open mind. And he also says that his ways are higher than our ways, and so there are going to be things that may not be obvious to us from the data at hand. And so the question then becomes, do we think just because we haven't thought of a way that fits into a narrative that makes sense, do we abandon it? Or do we try to look for a way to make sense out of it? And I'm going to come back, sort of cycle back around to this idea a little bit later. So, do we rush to judgment? I think we do. And I think that we do this in all kinds of ways, not just in the ways that we interpret scientific studies, but when we make observations, when we pay attention to what's going on around us, when we ask questions. These are ways that we can sort of flesh out if our judgment is holding up or if our judgment needs to be revised. And sometimes I think when we rush to judgment based on partial knowledge or partial observation, that it actually might blind us from greater discoveries. And so I think that there are a few examples. I'm going to check my notes and see if I have them over here. I do, in fact. And so here's one that's going to sound ludicrous to everybody, right? But let's say you've never seen, you don't know what a woman's breasts are for, and you've never seen a woman feeding her baby through breastfeeding. Well, you might, if you had no concept of either that activity or the function, you might rush to a judgment and say, this woman looks like she's trying to suffocate her child as she's trying to get her child to suckle off the breast, right? Well, that's ludicrous, right? Obviously, you've rushed to a judgment that's grossly inadequate. It's a simple example. I apologize for the simplicity of it, but I'm kind of trying to make a point that if you really don't understand anything, which some of us, as we approach the COVID situation and understanding viral pandemics, might be a little bit in that category where we've not really encountered these sort of public health policies or public health actions and what they might be doing, because we don't understand that a virus can live on hard surfaces, that we don't understand the difference between an airborne virus and a respiratory droplet, right? And so we may have some levels of ignorance that sort of parallel that in non-trivial ways. Other examples that I've just run across recently, to my utter amazement, I haven't paid much attention to ecology and conservation biology, but I just watched a fascinating documentary the other day on BBC on what wolves have done to Yellowstone, and how there was this controversy about not releasing wolves back into Yellowstone because the sheep farmers and the deer hunters thought that things would go awry. But releasing wolves back in set off an entire series of events that biologists, conservation biologists primarily have observed. And Yellowstone is now flourishing in habitats that are not at all intuitively linked to a superficial understanding of a wolf's activities. But if you understand how wolves impact the activities of coyotes, and how if you're putting coyotes into a more cautious stance, that you're opening up ecological space for small varmints that coyotes typically feed on, especially when they're unimpeded, to come back and repopulate an area. When you're pushing elk into forest areas because they're also trying to avoid the wolves, you're allowing grasslands and trees to grow where they haven't been able to grow, seed, and flourish in the years where the elk and the deer were feeding without predator. And so you're actually increasing the resources for insects, for birds, for beavers. And the impact of all of those open up the development of more waterfowl, more birds, more fish, more otters. And so it's had this drastic effect. It's basically transformed the landscape of Yellowstone just by reintroducing wolves into the ecological environment. It's another way to just emphasize that we make superficial judgments. This probably isn't going to be a good thing. Yes, maybe we want to save the wolves, but the risks involved are not worth taking to the sheep farmers or to the deer population. And yet, because we now understand really how things are interdependent, it's actually a very good thing for very many different species and for the ecological well-being of the national park in general. And so, I can give other examples, epigenetics, giant viruses. I'll circle back around to giant viruses, but these are just, if you don't know what epigenetics are and you're curious, that's the most curious question at the end. We can talk about that. But again, I'm going to ask the question, do we bring wrong assumptions into our models? And that leads really to these two questions that I think are really helpful for us to ask ourselves all the time, especially when we find ourselves, our backs starting to bristle, or we find within us that we're starting to sense that we're going to strongly disagree with this other person. What if our prevailing ignorance is the primary reason we quickly dub things as bad or evil, or what this person is saying is as bad or evil or just misinformed? But what if it's our prevailing ignorance? What if we don't understand something that they do? And what if things we principally see as bad around us are just failures to see a hidden or unseen good? What if this is just a challenge to our own presuppositions that we're bringing into our own models of understanding what's going on around us? So I've given this talk in a couple of different iterations where I've unpacked different aspects of this. And in both of those cases, I've sort of formed it in the question of evil in the natural world around us. You can go look at those talks. It's going to unpack some of the data that I'm not going to get to today. One of them is called God's Purposes Revealed in Science and Suffering. And that was from a talk that I gave last year. It's available on YouTube. Another one is a similar talk with different emphasis. That first talk emphasizes things like bacteria and viruses. The second talk emphasizes earthquakes. And that's a Reasons Forum talk. And you can find that on the Reasons to Believe YouTube channel with our Reasons Forum talk series. So just to briefly sort of give you some scientific examples of how our belief revision has been necessitated by discoveries, ongoing discoveries. I'm going to point to epidemics, right? And we have one going on now. We have a pandemic, which just means it's very widespread to many different countries, over 180 on all continents, but Antarctica in this particular case, and that there is unabated or easy human-to-human transmission. Those are the definitions and the points that need to go in for something to be not technically an epidemic, but technically now qualified as a pandemic. It has to be widespread. There has to be many places where there's independent human-to-human transmission of whatever the disease is. And so that's what's going on around us, and that's why it's been labeled a pandemic. But we could look at bacterial pandemics like the plague, which wiped out 60%. I mean, you think about case fatality rates right now in the US. The last time I checked, which was a couple of days ago, our case fatality rate, based on the numbers of tests that we've used, is about 3%. Some countries like Italy are over 10%. And so it's really drastically different from country to country. But the plague in the 14th century wiped out 60% of the European population. So, I think we think we haven't seen anything like this before, and we haven't, but humanity has encountered things like this before. And in the case with diseases and epidemics and plague and many different viral infections like HIV or other bacterial infections like malaria, we've historically known that these are bacterial and viral diseases. And so we've always sort of rushed to judgment of bacteria and viruses as something that are really, really bad. And yet we've known for a long time that bacteria actually do some really critical functions in our environment. They're primary producers. They fix inorganic nitrogen into biological molecules and building blocks that all other life on planet Earth depends upon. And without that function in bacteria of nitrogen fixation and being able to fix other inorganic elements into organic building blocks, no other life on planet Earth would be possible. They also recycle nutrients. They have a role in decomposition, sort of keeping those compounds and things in balance at a very fundamental level. But they also are part of our bodies. And without the contribution of bacteria in our own microbiomes, we wouldn't thrive as a species. We wouldn't live. We wouldn't be able to do certain things that we need to do digestively. And so bacteria are critical and sustain life, and they're everywhere. They're everywhere. They are legion. They are a multitude, and the vast majority of them aren't causing disease. And if we think about their role in that way, they actually are sort of ecosystem superstars, right? They're making all of life on planet Earth fundamentally possible. And so you can begin to ask, well, why do some cause disease, and why are some seemingly, why are the antibiotic resistant ones on the rise? And you can begin to sort of pick apart these questions where it's like, these seem to be in conflict. Are bacteria mostly good, or are they mostly bad because of the suffering and disease that they do cause? Well, the suffering and disease that they do cause, a lot of that can be mitigated. It can be inhibited if we're managing our environments properly. And I don't want to take time to unpack that, but antibiotic resistance is on the rise because we mismanage the use of antibiotics. And so that's sort of one simple example of what I'm talking about in the category of mismanagement. What about viruses? Also a cause of epidemics and one of this pandemic. I've given a whole nother talk on viruses called "Why Would a Good God Create Viruses?" That was from a similar conference 3 years ago. You can also, I think, find that on our YouTube channel. But you can read about it in a book called Building Bridges that you can get at reasons.org. Chapter 4 in that book covers why would a good God create viruses. I've also blogged on this topic, as have some of my other colleagues here. Well, viruses, like bacteria, are just, they're legion. They're everywhere we look. It's kind of stupid to say they're everywhere we look because you can't see viruses with the naked eye. But if you were able to go into the environment and collect a sugar cube's worth of dirt or a sugar cube's worth of seawater or ocean water and ask what's there, you'd find that there's tens of thousands of bacteria in that sugar cube of dirt or water, but you would find that there's 10 or 15 times more viruses in that same sample of dirt or that same sample of water. And so viruses are so abundant that if you were able to collect all of the viruses on planet Earth and line them up, not their DNA or RNA, but the virus particle itself, if you could stack them end to end, they would reach so far as to go all the way to the Andromeda galaxy, 2.5 million light years away. They would reach all the way to the Andromeda galaxy and back, and they would make that round trip 20 times. And so the vast majority of viruses around us are not doing anything associated with suffering or disease of plants, animals, or humans. They're actually something that's fundamentally important and foundational for life on planet Earth too. And I'll get that right after the next slide, which is just going to highlight that because I'm a virologist, I spent a lot of my time in graduate school and postdoc years looking at viruses and using viruses as tools. I can tell you that most of what we know about molecular and cellular biology, we know because of what we've been able to discover through studying viruses, and then using what we have discovered from viruses as tools to interrogate different aspects of cellular and molecular biology. So viruses are really this amazing tool of discovery in and of themselves. But more importantly than that, although I think that's really cool and really important, is that viruses are part of a checks and balances at the most fundamental level of life on planet Earth. Viruses aren't alive. Bacteria are. The vast majority of viruses infect bacteria. Bacteria are masters of reproduction and adaptation, and the vast majority of bacteria don't need other organic life in order to maintain a bacterial population because they are primary producers. The photosynthetic bacteria can take photosynthesis, sunlight, and turn that into organic foodstuffs. Chemosynthetic bacteria can do the same thing with chemicals that photosynthetic bacteria do with the sun's energy. They can turn chemical energy into a process of synthesizing organic molecules from inorganic substances. And so bacteria, because they can reproduce so quickly, they can double in 20 minutes, many of them. And because they can adapt through sort of swapping genetic information through horizontal gene transfer, bacteria should fill every ecological niche on planet Earth to the detriment of any other life being possible. And yet they don't, because they're kept in check by the vast majority of viruses which are infecting bacteria and regulating bacterial populations. Viruses can't replicate on their own. They need a living cell. Bacteria are living cells that are masters of reproduction and adaptation. And at the most fundamental level of life, we have these two entities, sort of predator-prey, if you will, in perfect balance, sort of a fine-tuning of Earth's ecological foundation so that life like ours can exist. Let me put it one other way. If it wasn't for viruses, Earth would be one giant ball of bacteria and nothing else floating through space. So that's great. These viruses that infect bacteria are called bacteriophage, and I have them pictured here in the middle of the slide, these sort of lunar landing module type shaped viruses. The SARS, the COVID-2 virus that we're dealing with now in the pandemic, these are electron micrographs of that virus in the square box on the top left. A similar virus, a rotavirus, is pictured in the blue fluorescence next to it. But what about these viruses that are causing human disease? What about those? Well, these viruses, the vast majority of many of the viruses that are emerging as human pathogens are actually isolated in bats. And so the question becomes, are they doing something good in bats? And I would suggest that there are many times we rush to judgment and say, well, these viruses are just killing humans. But we haven't taken the time to say, or to even explore, are these viruses doing something that are positive in an ecological sense within the host that they're normally found in nature? And so is there a role that's a positive ecological role for viruses such as these in the animal host that they actually inhabit in the environmental situations that that host finds itself, like the bat? So again, the mismanagement, our actions are actually exacerbating situations where viruses like SARS, viruses like MERS, which is another coronavirus, have made a leap from bats, usually probably through another intermediate animal host, into humans. And those leaps wouldn't normally be taking place in nature. And so the risk for us contracting those viruses from bats wouldn't be taking place if we weren't creating artificial systems for the transmission of those viruses. And so one of the things that we've done poorly on a global level between the first SARS outbreak and this SARS outbreak is that we know that some of the leaps were made because animals are crowded together in what's called wet markets, and animals that would never come in contact with one another in nature are being forced into close proximity and intermingling in very unsanitary and crowded conditions where human traders and vendors and consumers are intermingling as well. And so these types of markets are actually, in many people's opinion, mine included, they're breeding grounds for pandemics. And so, the first time SARS came out, the Chinese government shut the markets down and culled the intermediate animals by the tens of thousands. And we did barrier tracing and barrier practices and contact tracing. And we were able to bring the first SARS outbreak to a rapid end. It began in November of 2002. It was over by July of 2003. Only 8,000 people roughly were infected. A little less than 800 people died globally. And it impacted 27 different countries. Well, this virus is spread much further, much faster, and has a much more lasting impact. We're not going to be able to control it through public health measures, like to the same extent that we were able to do it to the first SARS outbreak. For many reasons, other than it already being widespread, this virus behaves differently symptomatically. And when something can be spread asymptomatically, it's much more difficult to control through public health measures. And yet we need not have faced this pandemic if we would have taken action to prevent the mingling of these animals with humans in these artificial environments of these markets, if those markets would have stayed shut down, or if they would have reopened in a different form, if we would have managed creation better based on the knowledge we already had, we could have avoided this particular pandemic. So again, now I just kind of want to make a little bit of a shift. What I've talked about so far is sort of how we rush to judgment based on the knowledge that we have. And the knowledge that we have is always incomplete knowledge. We can always learn more. And so as I shift into sort of the next section, and I'm not sure how long this is going to take, but I'm going to try and compact it as much as I can for the sake of time so that we have more time for questions. But this is really sort of at the heart of how I think about the goodness of God in light of even some suffering associated with viruses or some suffering associated with bacteria. And here I'm talking about that suffering that doesn't seem to be able to be completely erased or mitigated by better human behavior, right? That small amount that happens regardless of whether or not we're doing everything we can possibly do to manage creation and manage our environment well, to reduce risk to ourselves and to care for creation the best we can. There's still some of these viruses that we encounter or bacteria that we encounter that are associated with disease. So what do we do even with those low level elements of suffering or disease or adversity that we face? How do we think about those? And I think that one of the things that I want to do, and most people who hear me through, they find that these are really helpful ways to start to think about things that they may not have thought in this way before. And it's to ask sort of a fundamental question of, are we misunderstanding the role of adversity and suffering itself? Is there something that, some good that might actually come out of adversity that would not be brought forth if adversity never happened? And so I think that this idea is not unique to me. Many people have had very similar observations throughout various cultures and centuries, and we'll get to that in just a minute. But before I go there, because sometimes people are suffering right now, maybe even somebody who's listening to me is suffering deeply because they have a friend who's sick with COVID, or they have someone who's fighting mental illness or cancer, and so these can become very personal struggles and questions that are deep within us, either because we're experiencing it ourselves or somebody that we love or know is experiencing this kind of suffering. And I want to say that one of the most important things that I think that we as Christians need to realize is that when we see people suffering around us, one of the hallmarks of what it means to be in Christ and to follow Christ is, how do we respond to that suffering? How do we respond to it when we see it in someone else's life? And how do we respond to it when we experience it in our own lives? And I think that contemporary theologian N.T. Wright, Tom Wright, really addresses this from the best perspective that's resonated the most deeply with me of any that I've ever heard. And Tom Wright says the way of Christian witness, this is sort of the Christian call to our response in suffering. He says the way of Christian witness is not the way of quietist withdrawal, nor the way of militant zeal. It is the way of being in Christ in the Spirit at the place where the world is in pain, so that the healing love of God might be brought to bear at that point. It's actually very important, I think, to be in prayer at the place where the world is in pain. It's part of our Christian vocation. And this is sort of my call to action for those of us who are in Christ or who are Christ followers, who've had an encounter with the risen Lord and have given our lives to him, and he's empowered us with his Holy Spirit. It's to take action understanding that the world around us desperately needs us as image bearers, as hope bearers, as bearers of a message of love, of you're not in this alone. None of us are in this alone. And that we have Jesus as an example, and we have lots of scripture that points to this. I unpack the following concepts a lot more in that AMP talk called God's Purposes Revealed in Science and Suffering, at a depth I'm not going to be able to cover in the short amount of time I have left today, but I would encourage you to go look at that talk. It's a 30-minute talk, and so give that a shot maybe tomorrow sometime. But in Tom's words, we recognize some very important concepts, and that is that we are called as Christians in the face of adversity and suffering to some of the things that we value the most as human beings: actions of mercy and courage and bearing hope to one another. And it's our actions. It's not just the way that we think about the world. It's not the things we say we believe, but it's how we take those things and we actually put them into action, where we're reaching out to someone who's suffering to bear mercy and hope, even at risk to ourselves, which demonstrates courage to those around us. It's our actions that are the most important thing. And so whether we're Christians or non-Christians, and whether it's contemporary or historical observation, many people have observed that adversity is actually accomplishing some of these great things that we value the most as human beings, and that the adversity in and of itself is actually important for growing in what we call moral virtue. But as Christians, we believe it's even deeper than that. We believe that the adversities we face are actually what's calling us to grow into Christ's likeness and to mature in our faith as we rely on God and as we move in the power of his love towards us and towards others, and in the power of the Holy Spirit that empowers us as believers who have surrendered our lives to Christ. And so we'll even willingly engage in pain and suffering. We'll willingly engage in adversity if we think that we're going to gain from it, or if we think that we're going to accomplish something good for someone else by going through it, or if we know that the pain and suffering that we're going to invite or participate in is of a limited duration. It's not going to last forever. And I would say that this bears out even in simple examples. You know, if you're an athlete who's competing for a prize, or if you're a student who's studying for a better life or to make a better contribution, or if you're a parent who's working hard and sacrificing for the good of your children and the good of your family, or if you're a parent who's caring for a sick child, you'll take risks to expose yourself because you care so much for the child. These are very simple examples, and not all examples of adversity and suffering that we encounter are ones that we willingly enter into because we see the prize before us or the hoped for outcome, or how it's building into somebody else's life or helping somebody else be well or succeed. Sometimes the suffering is dropped on us, and I unpack this in the AMP talk as well, but I'm going to give one example in this talk. Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who was received the Nobel Prize in Literature, was a prisoner of state in the Soviet Gulag system, and he spent 8 years in the gulags. And he writes of his experience in the gulags, which were one of the most heinous environments for man's inhumanity to man. He writes there of his experience and the experience of over 230 other prisoners. He writes these words. These words may not make sense to you if you read them at face value, but he writes these words, and I would invite you to ask the question, what am I not getting if I don't get what he's saying here? He writes, "Bless you, prison, bless you. For lying here upon the rotting prison straw, I came to realize that the object of life is not prosperity, as we're made to believe, but the maturity of the human soul." And he's not unique in that perspective. And there are many more that I point to in the other talk. But could it be that he's touched on something where he's bringing out that we've fed the wrong assumptions into the model of trying to understand life. We've fed the assumption in that an adversity-free life is what's best. And yet, how can that be true if some of the things that we value the most are only brought out in the face of adversity? And so when we look at the situation around us right now, it is a situation packed with adversity and suffering. And yet, could it be that God's ways are so much higher than our ways that there is an underlying intent that's actually very, very good that can be brought out of even the most worst situation we find ourselves in? There's another verse in Scripture in Acts, which is a compilation of the acts of the early Christian followers put together by a historian named Luke. And he writes there of God, that God's purpose was for the nations to seek after him and perhaps feel their way towards him. Feel their way, maybe not be able to see it, but feel their way towards him and to find him, though he's not far from any one of us. And so this idea of adversity really accomplishing something good that can't be accomplished in the absence of adversity isn't unique to Christians, although Christians certainly highlight it. There are others who possibly aren't even theists, although maybe poet John Keats calls the vale of suffering the valley of soul making, or the other way around, something like that. Anyway. And so the question that I'm asking now is, what if these other people who observe how adversity is actually forming something very deep in us that was also in that passage or in the reference where I said that Christ likeness is being formed in us, the maturity of faith is being formed in us. What if they're right? What if suffering is actually accomplishing that? Then might that be a way that we can endure the suffering, realizing that it's accomplishing something good, something great is going to be brought out of it, and that it's not meant to last forever. And that we can alleviate one another's suffering when we come alongside one another and bear hope into each other's situations and remind people that they're not in it alone, and that there's this promise that our suffering won't be forever, and that there's this sense and promise and purpose that what we're going through is actually accomplishing something good. So I imagine we might cycle back around to that in the Q&A. I just want to take one quick moment, and I'm very near the end here, but this is something that just struck me over the last few days as we've been again in this season of Passion Week, the Holy Week that leads up to Easter and Good Friday, which was yesterday, the remembrance of Christ's sacrifice for us. And it ties in explicitly to this idea of God's perspective being different than our perspective, and us perhaps having wrong assumptions about the role of suffering in our lives. And so I just, for those of you that are not familiar with sort of the Christian perspective, I've got this, I'm going to flip off my slides here for just a second so that I can show you something. I've got this Oxford annotated Bible that has extensive scholarly notes at the beginning of every book that's covered in the Christian scriptures. And this is actually part of the Jewish scriptures, the prophet of Isaiah. And I'm just going to read briefly to you the background for the book of Isaiah. It says, the book of Isaiah, in its current form, was written and assembled over the course of several centuries. This process began in the 8th century BCE, before the Common Era, 8th century BCE, so 8th century before the birth of Christ. With the collection of the prophecies of Isaiah, son of Amos, who was active in the southern kingdom of Judah, don't really need to know all that, it was completed no later than the 2nd century before the Common Era, BC, before Christ. So it began 8th century before Christ, and was completed no later than the 2nd century before Christ. So during this time of the Passion Week, we often go back to prophecies of the Old Testament that prophesied the coming of God's Messiah, the person of Christ, God's anointed one, the deliverer. And so if we look at one of the most famous Christian passages from Jewish literature, we go to a passage called the Suffering Servant that's found in Isaiah 52, and it begins in verse 13, and it runs through Isaiah chapter 53, verse 12. But I'm going to read just briefly this whole passage, and there's a point that I'm going to emphasize at the onset, and I'm going to read it from a different version than the Oxford one. I'm going to read it from a version that I find a little easier to track with. But the first verse, and this is the one that I really want to emphasize, "See my servant, will prosper. He will be highly exalted. So if we stopped there, if that's our first observation, we're going to think, see my servant, he will prosper, he will be highly exalted. We probably have these ideas of, ooh, God's blessings on somebody, that person's gonna prosper. They're going to rise to preeminence. They're going to be exalted. It's going to look great. Good thing to be that servant, right? And then we go on and read the rest of the passage. That's the first verse, but the rest of the passage unpacks something we might not have rushed to have thought of. But many were amazed when they saw him. His face was so disfigured, he seemed hardly human. And from his appearance, one would scarcely know he was a man. And he will startle many nations. Kings will stand speechless in his presence, for they will see what they had not been told. They will understand what they had not heard about. Who has believed our message? To whom has the Lord revealed his powerful arm? My servant grew up in the Lord's presence like a tender green shoot, like a root in dry ground. There was nothing beautiful or majestic about his appearance, nothing to attract us to him. He was despised and rejected, a man of sorrows, acquainted with deepest grief. We turned our backs on him and looked the other way. He was despised and we did not care. It was our weakness he carried. It was our sorrows that weighed him down. And we thought his troubles were a punishment from God, a punishment for his own sin. But he was pierced for our rebellion, crushed for our sins. He was beaten so we could be whole. He was whipped so we could be healed. All of us, like sheep, have strayed away. We've left God's path to follow our own. Yet the Lord laid on him the sins of us all. He was oppressed and treated harshly, yet never said a word. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter. A sheep is silent before its shearers. He did not open his mouth. Unjustly condemned, he was led away. No one cared that he died without descendants, that his life was cut short in midstream, but he was struck down for the rebellion of my people. He had done no wrong and had never deceived anyone. He was buried like a criminal and was put in a rich man's grave. But it was the Lord's good plan to crush him and cause him grief. Yet when his life is made an offering for sin, he will have many descendants. He will enjoy a long life, and the Lord's good plan will prosper in his hands. When he sees all that is accomplished by his anguish, I think I've overshot the passage, but anyway, so sorry, I got caught up, wasn't paying attention to where I was. But the point is that there's a couple of things. Number one, it's amazing to us who are Christ followers to recognize so many parallels of the truth of the story of the historical account of what Jesus went through and how it matches so perfectly a prophecy that was given in 8th century before Christ or 2nd century before Christ. And yet in the context of our conversation today, which happens to fall in this time where we're focused on passages like this because of the Holy Week, we see a call to maybe ask ourselves, are we thinking wrongly about the role of suffering and adversity in our lives? Do we have a false narrative, a false story, a false assumption about what the model is supposed to look like? Do we think that an adversity-free world was ever in God's plan? And so deep question. Thanks for bearing with me as I kind of went scriptural on you there. But it's very much where I find myself thinking about these things today. And I'm wrapping up here. So Paul also says to believers in Corinth and believers in Rome, he says that these momentary light afflictions, and he's a man, and I unpacked this in the AMP talk from last year, but he says these momentary light afflictions are preparing for us an eternal weight of glory. He calls them momentary light afflictions. And if you go and read about Paul's lives and about the lives of the people that he's talking to, they're experiencing something, they're experiencing things that are far from what anyone in the midst of them would think were momentary or light. And yet he says that in comparison to what he knows is coming, that they're accomplishing something far greater. They're preparing for us an eternal weight of glory beyond all comparison. And I think I've already unpacked enough of the life of Jesus. I unpack it differently in the other talk. So again, if you want to go check that out. And this is sort of the end of that previous message that's out there. There's no evil. There's nothing. There's no adversity. There's no suffering so great that we face that the power of God to redeem it is not even greater. And yet one of the ways that he redeems that is not just through his presence with us and his promise to never abandon us, but it's through the actions of people like us who claim to follow Christ, who actually act in response to the suffering around us and the suffering in our own lives in ways that implement the faith and the belief and the compassion and the presence of God in such a way as to bear hope and to remind each other that it's accomplishing something good and that it won't last forever. And so this is really, I think, the best message that we can take into the days ahead of us as Christ followers is a message of hope, that our lives do have purpose, and they're given purpose by the person, the creator of all things, who has a plan for good for each of us, and who does not abandon us to that plan, but promises to accompany us personally with his own presence, with his own spirit as we walk that out, but that we are to be agents who are making God-centered, Christ-centered moral choices for the sake of those around us and not for the sake of our own lives, which are already secure in Christ. And so we make a big difference in how the world views what's going on around us. And we have impact in ways that maybe we haven't imagined. And so maybe we even put the wrong assumptions into the models of answering the questions of, do I have a purpose and what difference do I make? Maybe those are the questions that we need to challenge the most and encourage one another that, yes, you have a profound purpose and you can make a profound difference. So at that point, I'm going to stop screen sharing and come back to Q&A. And I didn't overshoot too bad. It was about an hour from the time I actually started talking. So hopefully we're all good. And hopefully I didn't break up too much while I was giving my presentation. Thanks,
I'm doing the virtual hand clap.
Yes,
So,
I see one person clapping. Thank you.
Yeah, we're all searching for that that hand clap symbol there.
That's okay. That's right.
Yeah. So AJ, thank you so much for that. That was great. Super moving. And you know, when you were encouraging us to take this hope and act on it, I just want to say that the first thing that came to my mind is that you're exemplifying that for us. So thank you for that. And I think that in this time, your voice is speaking very relevantly to a broad audience. And so I've been tracking just lately your talks that I can find on YouTube and on reasons.org. And they're definitely for a time like this. And so I'm super grateful that we can come away from spending an hour with you and come away with a renewed perspective on, you know, what seems to be a very dark time, you know, for our families and our country and the world, and see it from a renewed perspective. So I just want to commend you for that and thank you for sharing that.
Thanks, Ben. Thanks very much. And yes, I have been, it's kind of one of those weird paradoxical things of being a Christ follower in the midst of a bad situation. Somehow God allows blessings to sort of trickle through. And I kind of feel like I'm extremely blessed to be in this situation where I can sort of bring my knowledge of the virus, my understanding of the pandemic as best I can into an environment where other people can pick my brain and ask questions and maybe see some of the perspective that I've garnered over the years of wrestling with some of these questions very deeply in light of the Christian scriptures and what it means that God has created us in his image and that he desires our good and our flourishing. And so as I blog, as I speak, most of that stuff is finding its way out to either my Facebook page or my Twitter page or the Reasons to Believe website. They have both a YouTube channel. They also have a page that's dedicated to sort of COVID or the coronavirus for people that want to come and see not just my perspective, but the perspectives of other scholars here on the team. And when I tweet, and I try to keep my Twitter and my Facebook page current with stuff that I've read, perspectives that I think are reliable, and I'm putting it out there to try and help people have some of the best information that they can have with very little political influence and not very often too much preaching. Although, I have a couple of blogs coming out. One of them's sort of on the wet markets and the mismanagement there. But another one is really sort of highlighting again what I use as hashtags on my Twitter feeds. And it's to love boldly, to serve wisely, to think clearly, and to pray always. And I think that's some of the best things that we can be doing right now as Christ followers in the midst of this situation. Love boldly, take those courageous acts, serve wisely, right? Follow the public health guidelines and do that because you're really demonstrating the same love that causes you to love boldly. That same love of Christ that's motivating you to take those actions needs to be the same love that's motivating you to serve wisely and be precautious in protecting others who may be vulnerable, and you don't know who the vulnerable people are, by practicing good health hygiene. So and then to pray always, because when we pray, we open ourselves up to what God wants to do through us, and we employ God's action in the world around us, and that's profound. But to think clearly, and so a lot of that is don't spread misinformation, don't contribute to people's uncertainty, ask questions, try and get good sources, and to think deeply about it as you think clearly before you speak. And so, yeah. Anyway.
Okay.
Thanks, Ben.
Yeah, no, thank you. So I think we'd like to open it up for questions. So if you've got a question, what I'd like you to do is just kind of wave your hand so I can call an individual so we don't all talk over each other, and make sure you unmute your mic. Maybe I can just start by asking just a general question. I love how you've illustrated how the things that we at first glance see like they're terrible, but as those conditions drive us to discover, we see maybe an underlying good. So I think that's great. But my question is, how do we not swing the pendulum so far that we start calling everything good? How do we make the distinguishing between a bad thing that God uses for good versus, well, this is all a good thing, actually?
Yeah. That's a great question, Ben. How do we discern what's true? There are times when the questions are so profound that I struggle to know the best way to even think out loud about a response. And this may be one of those cases, but I think that one of the things we need to recognize is that, I shared this in the RTB Live Extra as well. I went through a time of spiritual formation that many other people in probably less Protestant backgrounds, more Catholic backgrounds maybe have experienced. Something called the Ignatian exercises. Ignatius of Loyola was one of the founders of the Jesuits, but he was, I think, really led by his immersion in the Word of God, the Scriptures, and through the Spirit to sort of discern a path of exploration of how God is at work in our own lives and how God is at work in the world around us. And one of the themes for one of the exercise periods is to really meditate on the profound effects that our sin has. And that word sin can be, among Christian audiences, that's fine. From the world's perspective, that word can kind of sometimes be a stumbling block. They don't get it. But there really are ways that if we make good moral choices, that we flourish. And if we make bad moral choices, those bad moral choices have consequences. And this section in the exercises really emphasizes that when we make bad moral choices, that the effects of those choices can be long-lasting and so extensive that we can't even begin to think or imagine the extent of the negative consequences of those actions. And so I would say one thing is to not believe that everything that we encounter is good, to acknowledge that there are bad choices, and that those are oftentimes driven by selfishness or greed or ignorance or hatred. I mean, there are all kinds of reasons that we can make bad choices. And that even in the midst of making that choice, we may recognize this is going to have negative consequences. But what we really don't recognize, again, because of our human finitude and our rush to judgment, is that those bad choices have consequences and ramifications that we don't even know, that we don't even think about, and that we can't even imagine, because it has a ripple effect. And so there is bad out there in the world. And you know, I haven't addressed it in this talk at all, but that's part of the Christian message of hope too, is that God has a solution for the badness of the human heart. And that's to come into our hearts and to change our perspectives and to change our desires in such a way that through the power of his Spirit and through community and living in community, in accountability with other people who are changed by the power of God's presence in their life, his Spirit in their life, are stirring one another up to love and good deeds, we have the power to make good moral choices, and we have the power to hold each other accountable in the choices that we are making, so that we're moving together in a way that's benefiting the lives of those around us and not making bad moral choices that have consequences that run amok. We have a way out of that predicament that's also present in the person of Jesus and in the gospel of our Christian witness. So.
Great. Who else has questions?
Difficult question, Ben. Hope all the other ones are equally theologically difficult for me to tackle right away off the cuff. But here you go.
No, that was great. Thank you.
And I have been answering all kinds of questions about COVID and SARS coronavirus too. I know quite a bit about it because of my background and my work on SARS coronavirus. So if you want to shift into that area, don't feel like you're being awkward by throwing a question out on that topipic. I'm welcome.
Great. So why don't we, I see Belinda has her hand up. Why don't you go ahead and go for
Belinda.
it. Belinda.
Yeah. Hi. So Joey Bixler, I think that's, you know her, Ben.
Joey.
Is asking for the names of some reliable resources that you trust, AJ, to obtain accurate information on this virus.
That's great. Thanks, Joey, for that question. I get it a lot. So, you know, definitely go to the cdc.gov. They have a great resource page. It may not be completely up to date because it's so hard to stay up to date in this information-rich environment. But they're reliable. Go to your local or state public health website as well, because a lot of the things that are being handled in this situation are being handled at state levels and not federal levels. And so CDC Center for Disease Control US is the federal level. Your local state public health departments is the local level. So you can go there. That should be very reliable information. WHO, World Health Organization, WHO.int is a global sort of case to go to see what's going on at a recommendation level at a global scale. I personally also go to Johns Hopkins University has Hopkins Center for Health Security, and they have a great resource page there for COVID-19. They have an interactive map where you can see what's going on globally with the situation, number of cases, number of fatalities, number of people recovered, and it breaks it down pretty much country by country. They'll also send you daily situation reports. If you sign up for an email, you'll get an email every day where they've sort of compiled information that's both US specific, but globally, global statistics as well and relevance. So they report on the case in Italy and Spain and where things are going poorly currently and things like that. So you can sign up for that. It's a free situation report that they'll send to you. Now, I have in the past always said, well, social media is a horrible place for reliable information, but I have found that there are really good, reliable people on Twitter. And by mentioning these people, I am going to emphasize that I think their science and their thinking is very clear. I am not endorsing any political perspective that they're taking or any political bias. For the most part, they are emphasizing the public health and the scientific points, and they are not steering it towards a political conversation. And so I respect them for that, but occasionally their political biases will come out. And I just want you to know, by recommending them for their science and their public health expertise, I'm not endorsing their political stance one way or the other. And so the people I go to on Twitter are Helen Branswell. She is a senior writer for Stat News that covers infectious diseases, and I've been following her for years, primarily because she covers other diseases like Ebola and other things that I'm interested in. Scott Gottlieb is the former director of the Food and Drug Administration, former director of the FDA for the U.S. He's fairly reliable as well, although people were jumping on him the other day because he posted something that was an incorrect assumption that went into his conclusion. And a lot of the people that were tracking him were like, hey, wait a minute, you left this out of your consideration. And so I like that too, that a lot of these people have sort of watchdog followers that'll jump on them if they're putting something out there that may not be as well thought through. And then another guy named Trevor Bedford, and he's a researcher at Fred Hutchinson in Seattle, Washington. And Trevor Bedford has been following sort of the viral epidemiology and how the virus is changing as it moves through different populations and spreads around the globe. And he's been involved, and some of his colleagues have been involved in sort of generating policy based on those observations as to what's the best way out of this. How do we get out of our current lockdown or social distancing or stay at home? What do we need to see happen, and what's the course for sort of getting out of there? Now, I just mentioned a lot of different sites. I don't want you to come to me as your only source, but I sort through a lot of these things and I post the ones that I think are most helpful and most relevant on my Facebook page and on my Twitter page. And so you can also come to me as a resource. My Facebook page is AJ Roberts RTB. AJ Roberts RTB, and my Twitter is RTB_AJ Roberts, and so you can follow me too.
Right, yeah, that's those are great resources. I have to say that you know, as we're looking for accurate information, and particularly one that sees it from a Christian worldview, as you've kind of laid out for us. You know, my first choice is to go to reasons.org and, you know, see what I can find there, because I know not only are you guys experts in the science, but you're also bringing the solid Christian worldview into the mix and being able to understand it from that perspective. So, you know,
rzim.org, they've got some great thinkers and people who think through these things very deeply too. Maybe not always from the scientific perspective, but certainly from the gospel action and where is God in the midst of this, and how do we think about these things theologically and as Christians. They've got great perspectives. John Lennox, Abdu Murray, Amy Orr Ewing. I mean, rzim.org is a great resource too.
Awesome. So Derry, go ahead. You've got your hand up.
Yeah, I have a question. What are your thoughts about reopening things and getting back to some semblance of normalcy? Because I know that there are a lot of implications for people who are out of jobs and, you know, have all kinds of living situations that are a problem. So what are your thoughts, knowing what you know about the virus?
Yeah, you know, for the most part, I'm going to say that I've respected Anthony Fauci since I first knew of him, and I've known of him since I worked for the NIH back in 2003. And I think that, you know, I think he is very knowledgeable, and his focus is in the right place. And so I have a very high level of trust for almost everything that he says. There's occasionally something he'll say where I'm like, oh, well, I think the emphasis is slightly distorted in that statement, but I don't want to call into question even those small things, because I think he's an incredibly reliable source. And so There's another page, sort of the COVID response coming out of the crisis, that I have pinned to the top of my Facebook page. That's a policy document that was drawn up. I think things that are in his statements and in documents like that are really important. And what are some of the elements there that are maybe worth highlighting? We really need to continue to maintain the social physical distancing that we have in place, because we're learning that so many of the cases may be asymptomatic. I've seen numbers anywhere as low as the CDC's 25%, to well-documented cases where it seems to be closer to 50%, and some estimations where it can be mild to no symptoms up to 80% that came out early in some of the studies from China. So all of that to say, asymptomatic spread is real. How real is it and to what percent? We don't know until we begin to do a widespread what's called serological testing. And that's looking at people's blood to see if they have antibodies that recognize and neutralize the virus. And if we find those antibodies in their blood, we have the data. Did that person have symptoms or have they not had symptoms? And so what level of the population is asymptomatic? Why am I even bothering to emphasize that so much right now in light of your question? Because one of the things we need to safely come back to a level of almost complete normalcy is to reach a level in the population where we have what's called herd immunity, or have artificial ways to treat people who become sick, even if we haven't reached that level of herd immunity. And herd immunity is basically how many people in the population have developed immunizing responses, so that if they encounter the virus again, they will be protected completely, or they will be protected at least enough to not have severe course outcome, at least not for very many people, at least not very often. And so that's something called herd immunity. We think that needs to be around 80%. And again, that's an estimate based on our current best data for how this virus is spreading and what will actually break the train of transmission in the general population. We want to buy time so that we can find drugs that are effective, so that we can run studies on hydroxychloroquine to see if it's actually safe and efficacious, and if so, at what dose, by what route, administered at what time in the course of the infection. Can we give it before somebody's been infected, or do we need to wait until they've been infected? And can we tell when a person's crossed that barrier? Well, not without widespread virus testing. And so we need widespread serological testing, which is a different test. And we need widespread virus testing, which is the one that everybody knows about, that's happening in the news all the time, with the swabs up your nose. And so we need more widespread testing of that kind, and we need to implement and get widespread testing for serology as well. That's one of the major things we need in order to get back to normal. I think this virus is probably going to be around in the population for, I hate to predict, but my strong sense is that this virus isn't going anywhere until we get to herd immunity at a global level. And then it's probably going to persist like other coronaviruses and influenza viruses do in the population. But it's not going to be persisting to the same level where our health systems are in crisis because so many people are getting exposed and coming down with serious illness in a very short amount of time. And so that's why we've implemented all of these public health actions. It's to, as you've heard, slow the spread, flatten the curve. And that's really so that we can maintain our healthcare system in a way that can respond to the needs of the population as this spreads through the population. And so how long do we need to stay in stay-at-home mode? How long do we need to stay at lockdown? We just have to be patient and watch the curves, and we have to pay attention to the curves. And so when the curves start to come down, we can maybe stay at home a little less, but we still need to do the physical distancing. We still need to wear the masks until we have the widespread testing to tell us, okay, chances are there are a lot of asymptomatic spread, maybe not so much asymptomatic spread. That'll inform whether or not we need to keep wearing the masks or not. But so we have to pay attention, we have to be patient, we have to listen to what the data is showing us, because that needs to inform our policy, needs to inform our actions on an ongoing basis. But again, I don't want to predict, but I think we're going to be pretty much in stay at home. I think we're going to be here for at least a couple more months, but I could be wrong. I mean, if all of the curves start to come down, then obviously I'm going to be glad that I'm wrong. I don't think that there's going to be a seasonality to the same extent that we see with flu. And I actually heard people in the public media actually articulate this past week. And I've been saying that for the past 4 weeks. And it's based on the biology of the virus, that it's just really pretty stable outside the body, that yes, high heat, yes, high humidity can reduce its infectivity, but it's high heat and high humidity for long duration that reduces its viability by a little bit. And so I don't think it's going to have the same seasonality that flu has. But that's not to say that in the summer, the transmissibility might be reduced. I don't think it's going to go away, but maybe it'll be reduced. And so, you know, will we be, this is what really matters to me on one level, Derry, will we be able to go to football games in the fall? You know, my friend and I were talking about that just yesterday, and she's like, oh, I hadn't even thought about that. She goes, I'm so sad now. But I don't know. I don't know that we'll be back to that level of normalcy with large crowds in sort of uncontrolled environments where we're up close with people that probably aren't all going to be wearing masks at a football. I don't see that happening. I don't think that football is going to happen the way that it happened last fall. Again, I could be wrong, but I don't think so. How long do I think it'll take us to get to herd immunity? I don't know. A lot of that is dependent upon how widespread asymptomatic spread is. If that number is high, we're going to get lucky and we're going to be, you know, have less constraints in a shorter amount of time if there are a lot of asymptomatic spreads going on. If they're not, if you know, we sort of have a handle and it's really only about 25%, then a lot depends on how much it's slowed in the summer months and how quickly it comes back in the fall. But we could be doing these types of activities through the end of the year, maybe. And I mean the calendar year, not the school years. So,
wow.
Yeah, I don't know. You know, those models peter out after so many weeks. It's kind of like those models are also start to fail on sort of the right end of the curve as it's come down. You know, they end, and it's like they don't end because something's not going to still be going on. They end because the model doesn't know how to crunch the data past a certain point because there's too many variables.
Yeah,
so
thanks.
Yeah, thanks. So Doug, Kyle has a question, and I know we're a little bit over time. So why don't we try and just wrap it up in one or two questions? I don't know, AJ, you just tell us when we've got to cut it off.
I have time. I can give you another maybe 20 minutes, but I'll also try and keep my answers short so we can.
Yeah, this is great. So we'll go ahead and take a couple more questions. So Doug, go for it.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yep, I can hear you, Doug.
Okay. So the question I have is a little bit about the science of this, in which obviously you've spent time thinking about. So just got done talking about the curve rolling over. What I'm kind of puzzled about is what is the mechanism that causes it to roll over and head down? It's the virus runs out of hosts in which to replicate, or what?
Yeah,
I mean,
it's because why
the curve just doesn't keep going up.
Yeah, the curve gets interrupted and starts going down because we've inhibited human-to-human transmission, or human-to-human transmission has been inhibited, both. And so it's both our actions through socially and publicly distancing and wearing masks that we're interrupting the possibility of human-to-human spread, and it's also going down on its own because as the population becomes more and more people infected, then the possibility of someone coming in contact with someone who hasn't been infected, that chance spread also decreases. And so that second thing is something called a replication factor. And early models, I haven't seen a recent model, but early models of what they thought the replication factor was for this virus was between between 1.5 and 3.1. So that means if one person is infected, how many people are they likely to spread it to? The answer is at least 1.5 other people, at most 3 other people. But we know that at most that's not true because, and this is for symptomatic people, right? Not for asymptomatic. We don't have a clue what the numbers are for asymptomatic spread, but for symptomatic spread, we know that one individual in China gave it to 13 healthcare workers. We know that 1 or 2 people who attended a 2-day meeting in Boston gave it to 77 other people. And so we know that number is sometimes much higher than that. And so in order for us to reach herd immunity where we don't have to have these constrictive mobilization or behavioral policies in place where we're out mingling again, we know that we need that replication factor to be less than 1, because it's when the replication factor is less than 1 that it's not likely for someone who's infected to give it to someone else. So hopefully that answers your question. Did it?
I think so. Yeah, thank you. I just, I'm thinking of well, we can.
So Doug's audio is a little funky. So
I should let someone else talk.
so Belinda, I
think he's hesitant to redirect his question. He wants to open it up to someone else. But if you want to redirect it, Doug, go ahead. Take a second to do that.
Well, okay, yeah. I maybe just a second, and I'll let the moderator decide if we want to go there. But basically, this is to model these things. It's basically some sort of differential equation that you have a coefficient in, and that's.
Yeah, I'll let you look up those papers, right. Doug, now that you know what to look for. Virus replication factors, and it's designated by a capital R with a subscript O, the R0 factor. And for flu, just as a comparison, for flu, that transmission rate is probably 1.2 to, I think 1.2 to 2, something like that. And so for flu, the transmission rate's lower than for this virus. And like I said, those were early estimates of the transmission rate, the replication factor for this virus. Okay. It's probably changed.
Probably good enough.
Great, thanks. Thank so, hey, Dennis, I think I saw your hand up a minute ago. So go ahead and unmute and ask your question.
Dennis.
Hi there. Hey, with this virus affecting so many people and economies, we seem probably for the moment we've got infinite money and political will, kind of an opportunity for a moonshot. How close are we to kind of either a universal viral muting or controlling viruses a little more than we're able to now, which is almost nothing? And how can we use viruses as a tool in the toolbox, similarly to maybe a vector or something for some good?
Yeah.
Everything's a tool.
Yeah. So that second question, I am definitely punting you back to our resource page at reasons.org. We've got audio, we've got video, and we've got written material there that tackles the questions about using the virus as a tool, or I sometimes put it in the terms as viruses in redemption, right? Because it's our ability to go into creation and take things that we learn and use it in redemptive ways to help mitigate disease and suffering. And so my resources out there, Fuzz, Hugh, they've all written on that topic. But the first part about how soon will we have a drug, how soon will we have a vaccine? Yes, we have political will. Would that we all had like printing presses where we could make our own money to solve all of our monetary problems. I guess we'll deal with that later. But so everybody is committed to fast track both drugs and vaccines, but the people that need to have the controlling voice in those conversations need to be those that are also advocating for fast but safe. And so there are certain corners that we just should not cut when it comes to wide distribution of a drug or use of a drug that's already out there for a different disease. Those things have to be explored in a systematic way, and they have to be evaluated for efficacy. Are they going to be effective when we start implementing it? And safety. Is it not creating another problem or making a potential problem even worse because we've overlooked something? And there is reason to think that for some of the drugs, hydroxychloroquine, it's inconclusive whether that's having a huge benefit and for which group. and when it needs to be administered. And it certainly is associated with higher risk and poorer outcomes for certain people with certain conditions. And so those questions need to be asked about it in combination with the disease that's associated with this virus, not with malaria, not with rheumatoid arthritis. And those are controlled studies that are taking place and that need to take place. But if that pans out to be a good drug candidate, that can be upscaled and distributed very quickly. So, maybe in less than 6 months, if it's successful, we can be using hydroxychloroquine effectively. Plasma transfer is certainly effective, but it's a limited resource. So we need plasma transfer being taking convalescent serum from someone who's recovered from an infection. It has protective antibodies. You take that protective antibody component and you passively transfer it to someone who's fighting the disease and not doing well. That has shown time and time again that it has a very positive effect. And but it's a limited resource. And until we have widespread serotesting, we don't know how many people we can be asking for their convalescent serum, right? Because we don't know how many people have asymptomatically recovered from the disease and perhaps produce enough antibody that it can help save somebody else from a poor outcome. That's also something that if we had widespread testing, that should be fairly easy to expand that. Maybe not to a large scale where it's a treat all end all for everyone, but it's a contributing factor to treating some of the most serious cases. There's another drug that's been in clinical trials since February, and the data for those trials is due out this week. And so based on what they've seen there are also ongoing clinical trials with that drug. That's one that many people think is the best candidate. But best candidate means best candidate at this point in the process, right? And it's an inhibitor, but an inhibitor of viral replication, but it has to be administered intravenously. And so that's not going to be widespread available for everybody. There are a couple in the laboratory that are showing really strong inhibitory potential in laboratory experiments that aren't in human clinical trials yet, but they're moving into human clinical trials. And so we should have some preliminary data, but human clinical trials require 3 phases. And the 3 phases, each phase takes time to set the study up, to implement the study, to collect the data, and to analyze the data. And then you set up the next phase, or maybe they overlap by a little bit. But in each phase, you're saying, is it safe to give people? And so that's the first question in all 3 phases is it safe? And then the questions that they pick apart is it effective? How effective? How do we need to administer it both by route, dose, and timing? And which one of those ways of administering it is most effective? So we have to pick through all those questions and we have to do it systematically. And so that's why you hear estimates of a vaccine is probably 18 months away. Maybe less, maybe it's only 16 months now because we've been saying that for a couple of months. But there are certain things you just can't truncate. And if you truncate it, you run risks based on some observations that may or may not play out into making a situation worse. So with this particular family of viruses and a couple of other human pathogen families of viruses, what you will sometimes see, and we don't understand exactly when this is going to happen or how to predict when it will happen. What you sometimes see is if you get an immune response to a virus that you've given it either bits of pieces of the virus or you've given it the virus, you get an immune response to that virus, and that immune response is not sufficient to actually inhibit the infection. It might help mitigate the infection, but when you get to levels where it's not stopping the infection, something that rarely but sometimes happens is it's called sub-neutralizing antibodies, that those sub-neutralizing antibodies can have a very negative effect because they recognize the virus, they bind the virus, but then that antibody bound to the virus now allows that virus with the antibody bound to it to get into other cells it wouldn't normally get into and creates a scenario that's called antibody enhanced disease. And we don't want that to happen. That would be tragic if we come up with a vaccine that in a large portion of the population is developing some immunity, but not protective immunity. And if in this case, it turned out to be one of those rare instances where that sub level of immunity actually enhances disease, that would be catastrophic. And so we have to be careful of not setting ourselves up for a scenario like that. And the way we do it is to go through these clinical phases in the proper way, not rushed, and collect the data and analyze the data, and then make informed decisions.
All right. Wow. A lot to digest. Let's take one more question, and then I'll pray, and we can.
Belinda?
Belinda, go for it.
Hey, thanks. So I have a question. Rana has talked in the past about how we can discover God's design by seeing hallmark characteristics of human design kind of things, such as, let me see, like precision, fine-tuning, optimization, and such. And so I was just wondering, for the SARS-1 or SARS-CoV-2, have you seen any of those hallmark characteristics? And if so, what can you share with us about them?
Yeah, I think. Yeah, I think not. to give you a short answer, to give you a much more speculative and perhaps longer answer, but much more speculative answer, is that yeah, it's very speculative, and it's so speculative, I'm not even really sure it's going to be helpful. But it may be that, although there aren't neutralizing antibodies from other coronaviruses that are effective in prohibiting infection from this virus, total speculation, we haven't looked yet to see if there's any type of immunity that's provided from previous coronavirus infections that might be contributing, highly speculative, to asymptomatic outcomes of the spread of this virus. And so if that were true, a big, huge if, right? We don't even know that that's a genuine scenario that I've just unpacked under my highly speculative moment. But if that were true, that would suggest that, yeah, there are things in nature that are actually already present that aren't really associated with large courses of human suffering or even disease, maybe just a common cold, that are actually providing protection for us. And if we see that those coronaviruses are actually serving in other species, in other ecological niches, positive ecological functions that we have yet to discover, then again, that would point to sort of God's providential care, in that this has escaped that situation because of human mismanagement. But as it escaped that situation and has entered into the population, that there is a widespread underlying aspect that keeps most cases asymptomatic. And so it could have been much worse. And so that sort of addresses it in this, the way that life is playing out in God's creation may be in checks and balances and tuned so that human suffering isn't as severe as it could be, even when humans are causing great potential for disease and harm because of our mismanagement of creation, that even when it gets to that level, God's grace is already there providing some protection for us. Does that make sense in my speculative mode?
Yes, thank you.
No, I think that does make a lot of sense. And
if nothing else, let me end with this really positive tongue-in-cheek note. Yeah. We could look at SARS-1 in 2002, 2003 as a warning. And honestly, many of the countries who did well, although we may not have approved of some of their courses of action for dealing with it, but many places like Hong Kong and Singapore, because they experienced the first SARS outbreak more profoundly than most of the rest of the world, were ready for the second one, ready for this one. And so Hong Kong and Singapore have not been comparatively hit as hard as other areas because they learned, they prepared, and then when it happened, they took action. And so could I, without depressing anybody too much before Resurrection Sunday tomorrow, suggests that perhaps this is another warning sign. And we, on a global level, are learning all of the ways that we are not prepared. And for years, for decades, scientists have thought the next serious pandemic to hit us is going to be an influenza pandemic. And there are candidates out there with a much higher fatality rate than this virus. And could this be yet another warning where it's like, my dear children, people of the world, take note, take heed, get your priorities straight, do what you can do to prevent these types of pandemics from happening, but be prepared so that when they do happen, you know how to act, you know how quickly to act and in what ways to act so that you can mitigate the risk and save lives.
Wow, that's great. I'm so glad you said that. That was one of my questions. And so you said it was tongue in cheek, but I think it's very profound. And I think—
No, what was tongue in cheek was that was encouraging.
Oh,
Yeah.
No, it is encouraging because to me, I think it reinforces the call to action, and the call to action for us to wake up and, do what we can and seek, as we've heard a lot today, how do we be part of turning this for good? It's not a good thing, it's a bad thing. How do we turn it for good? So let me wrap us up. First of all, I just want to thank everybody who's joined us on Zoom, RTB chapter people from Portland. Great to see you all. Thank you guys on our YouTube live stream, and thankfully the technology seemed to held together. And most of all, AJ, thank you so much. I know,
Thanks,
again, you are really busy during this time, but boy, this has been just a treasure for us to have you and share what just great information, great counsel, and your heart for Christ.
Yeah, go out there and enjoy tomorrow. Enjoy the celebration of the resurrection, and remember that we have this hope that is both beneficial and purposeful and needful in the world around us.
Amen. Well, let me pray and then we can wrap up. Lord Jesus, we are grateful, Lord, for your presence in our lives. We're grateful for technology. We're grateful for people, Lord, and we're grateful for people like AJ and resources and ministries like Reasons to Believe that we can turn to, Lord, in these times for accurate information. May you equip us, encourage us, and send us out to be witnesses of you, to be lights during this time to the world. And may people come to know you in ways that they never have during this time. We love you and praise you in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
Hey, amen. So, hey, before we go, I just want to remind people one way I think we can really, it's a low bar to take action. Go to AJ's resources, her social media, her Facebook, her Twitter, subscribe, follow, and then share. And get more people connected in and being able to follow this type of information.
Pick whichever resource you like best, but I want to tell you that there's one that's going to be out there if it's not already on the, other than my recent blogs, there's one out there that's going to be on the reasons.org coronavirus page. That's an interview that I did with a couple of pastors in Salina, Kansas, and the interview is called Truth Revolution. And I think that's one of the best resources out there right now.
Excellent, excellent. So everybody go and watch that and then share it on your social media. So just get the word out. All right. Well, thank you all. Thank you, AJ. And we'll see you next time. All right. God bless.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, AJ. It was very enjoyable.